Hello, my name is Tom Cronin. In 1991 and 1992, I conducted a comprehensive series of interviews on camera with a diverse, often eclectic cross-section of Orleans residents. Some I knew personally, others I had never met. All had a solid connection to Orleans. The intent of these interviews was to record through the eyes of the people and their experience, their history of the town. Funding for the series was provided by a generous grant from the Community Preservation Council of $18,000 and a further contribution of $12,000 from American Heritage Realty, now Cape Cod Ocean View Real Estate. I sincerely hope you enjoy our series, In Those Days, Historic Voices of Orleans. Hello.
Gee, I'll do it.
You better go outside, actually.
Where? How do you do?
Hi.
We
How you
had somebody
doing?
from Worcester Academy come, taking pictures of Todd, and we were outside.
Uh-huh.
Pretty good.
Where would be the best place?
I think outside would be nice because there's no wind today.
Oh, no, that's nice out there.
Yeah. How you doing, Todd?
Well, all right, but
What?
I'm concerned about this because I'm not a... I've been here quite a while.
This is a perfect spot out here, Todd. We're going to set up right over there. That'll be perfect. Todd, let me introduce Todd Owen and Mrs. Owen. Your first name is?
Aline.
Aline. And you're the granddaughter of Jonathan Young, is that correct?
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter. Granddaughter.
When
David
did
Young.
when did Jonathan Young live in Orleans?
Always.
But he, what period? The late 1800s?
He said,
Jonathan Young?
Yes.
he said, when did he live?
When?
Yes. He always lived in Orleans, the late 1800s.
Late 1800s.
I never knew him, of course,
Yeah. Why was that windmill named for Jonathan Young?
because he owned it.
Oh.
He owned it, and it stood where the Governor Prince Motel is now, because that's high. And his home was what is now Tree's Place.
Oh, that's
That is-
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes, that was Jonathan Young's home. And he built the house across the way, which is owned by St. Joan of Arc. He built that for a wedding present for my father and mother. My father, wait a minute. No, that's not right, because my father was born in that house. He built it anyway and gave it to them.
Mm-hmm.
He was born, father was born in that house.
And so the windmill, they call that the Jonathan Young windmill, the
Jonathan
one
Young
that's at the
windmill.
town cove now?
Originally, Jonathan Young and his associates built that windmill. And they had it operating in Orleans for quite a few years. commercially. And then as they began to import more grain, the windmills, you might say, went out of business, and they were ornamental. Then a rich family, I think in Harwishport, bought it and transferred it, took it apart and transferred it over onto the Bass River, right by Bass River, just where Harwishport ends and Bass River begins. And they had it there for many years, but finally the grandchildren inherited the property, and the windmill ran down, was in very bad shape, and they either had to spend a lot of money building it up again, or they could give it away. You know, they decided to give it to the Orleans Historical Society, and the Historical Society accepted it and transferred it, and Bill Quinn and friends went over there and took it apart and numbered all the parts carefully. Then they brought it back to Orleans and they stored it for a couple of years. And when they began to put it together again. But when they began putting these numbered parts together again, they could put it together, but the parts were much of it was in very poor condition. And so they had to make new parts to go in there, and it was very expensive, It was easy to see then that it had been much cheaper to build a whole new windmill than to take that one and rebuild it. However,
but it's nice to have a lot
of the authentic thing.
But
and eventually, after several more expensive years, off and on working on it, and then raising more money and working on it some more, they got it in shape so they could put it up if they could find a proper piece of land. And after a while, they found this land down by the Orleans Inn, and eventually the money ran out. Well, it ran out several times, but eventually they'd made much progress, and the town decided to buy that land that they wanted for a park.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea was conceived to put the windmill on that land that the town supplied. That's very brief history of the Orleans windmill. But
Todd, I first met you a couple of weeks ago at the Marine Corps ceremonies down at Eldridge Park.
So. Yeah, I know him.
And one of the things that you're famous for in this town is your age.
Yeah.
And the public address announcer introduced Todd Owens, and I don't think you heard this, but he said, and he's 106 years old.
Well, it's unlikely I'll ever reach 106, and that would be quite a misrepresentation.
Well, how old are you now?
101.
When's your birthday?
March 6, 1891, I was born.
And you don't think you're going to make 106?
He's got to, because his license is
I never.
for 5 years. His automobile license he paid for 5 years.
When did you get your license renewed?
Oh, I got my license renewed a few days before my birthday. And when they saw what I'd put down that I was born in 1891, the girl said, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, there's a big mistake. And I said, mistake?
This is after you'd passed.
What mistake? Well, she said, according to this, you'd be 100 years old. You couldn't be 100 years old. I said, sure it could. I'll be 101 in 3 days. My father and mother, they heard it was very nice here on the Cape, so they decided to come and try out the Cape. So I came here in 1906, and as a boy, and with the family, and I drove them down here with a learner's permit that I'd gotten. I was 15 years old, and that summer here, I got my license, my first license in Woods Hole in 1906.
What were you
And
driving?
according to my arithmetic, that makes me having a license now for 86 years. And when we drove down here, the car's name was, it was an Overland, and it was made out in Toledo, Ohio. And it was a well-known, moderately priced car in those days.
You went to Falmouth.
And we went to Falmouth Heights, which is on the Vineyard Sound. It was a very popular place. And we had a cottage there. But when we came down here, it would take us 2 days to come from East Orange or New York City, which are equidistant. And we'd stay at the, I remember, Mohican Hotel in New London. That's as far as you got in one day. And you had to go all along by what's now Route 1,
The Boston
which they
Post
call
Road.
the Shore Road, but that was the only road there was. You'd go through those cities like Bridgeport,
New Haven,
New Haven, Hartford,
New London.
New London. And then when
And
you got to a
Providence.
place in Rhode Island called Jamestown, you took a ferry. And the ferry took you over
To Newport?
to Newport. And then you took another ferry and from Newport, and that took you over to New Bedford,
Yeah.
Fall River, I guess.
Yeah.
And then you could come down here without crossing any more sizable rivers. And
So your father let you drive up to the Cape
he
Cod with a
couldn't help
learner's
it. He
permit?
didn't drive. He didn't drive for several years. and we had horses and carriages, but they came separately. And
There couldn't have been too
but
many
the
cars.
postman couldn't drive the car, so I had to drive the car. But that was
And
all right.
you remember that drive? You remember it?
Oh yes, I drove that for several years. They'd bring a family down. But each year the roads would improve, and you'd cut off a little and take a new road, and they began to get inland roads. But all the roads inland were pretty much country roads and sand roads. So when I got down here in 1906 at Cape Cod, at Falmouth Heights, they had a ball team there, which was called, the Cottage Club. They had a club there, a social club for Harwich-Port called the Cottage Club, because that place was full of cottages and about 3 hotels, good hotels. I remember coming down to Chatham at 1908, and a friend of mine had a sport automobile called the American Underslung, and it was very low to the ground. It wasn't a practical car for the Cape, because the Cape had mostly country roads, and they were sand, and very soft sand on each side of the car. And once you got off that, into that sand, you had to send for a farmer and 2 horses as a rule to pull you out. I remember getting a shovel and carrying a shovel, but we shoveled and shoveled, we couldn't.
Was that the one with the rumble
So
seat?
some of the fellows went down to play baseball in, I think, 1908, and some went by buckboard, and a team of horses, and they could get six or maybe 8 people on the buckboard. And this fella, Blondie Walker, and I had his father's car, and we drove it. I think I drove it to Chatham. And then he learned from me pretty much, and he tried to drive it on the way back. And at night, it was a beautiful moonlight night. I remember this so well because it's one of the funniest experiences of my life. This sport car had a rumble seat. And of course, we had 2 girls with us. And we knew the Cape, and it was cold, so we were prepared, and we had a blanket. And this girl, Betty, and I, coming back, we got in the rumble seat. And after a while, we covered ourselves up with a blanket. But before that, I told Blondie Walker he'd have to drive careful because I didn't think he had much gas in the lights. In those days, you had a little gas tank on the running board, and a rubber hose took the gas to the headlights, and you lit them with a match. Well, at any rate, Betty and I, we finally were pretty much asleep in the rumble seat, and all of a sudden I felt the car go off the road, and I heard a lot of noise, and it was bright moonlight, and I got out of the rumble seat, which was quite a trick to get in and out of, and a horse was jumping up and down in front of us in the shaft, and I knew how to handle horses, so I got the horse by the head and hold his head down so he couldn't jump up and down and kick the buggy anymore. And the fellow was standing up in the buggy as best he could, but the front wheel was dished. The front wheel was broken. We hit up the front wheel, and we hit the horse's leg, it turned out. Well, I said to the fellow, well, didn't you see us coming? Well, yeah, but poor lights. I said, why didn't you holler? He said, I tried to holler, but I couldn't because I stutter. And I remember this all my life. It was one of the funniest things, you know. So, about a year later, Blondie Walker's father had to pay $350 to repair the buggy and fix up and have the horse attended to. That was when we went to Chatham. Then after that, a year after that, we came down to play ball here in Orleans. And those days, they had a very rough, poor ball field. And I remember I was a good fielder, but not a very good hitter. So I hit a ball, and it went over in the center field. It hit a rock that was there, and it took a beautiful bounce into a lot of bushes, and it made a home run. And I think that won the ball game. And there was a fellow there that played center field for well-known in Orleans, and he was a special policeman here for years, and he also was a manager, what do you call it?
You mean you want to know his name?
No, Elmer Darling
Yeah.
was his name, and he was very well known here in town, and he was a good ball player. So then the next year we came down, and they had a new park, Eldridge Park, and that was much better. And there again, for some unaccountable reason, I hit a ball, went out in the outfield over the same Elmer Darling's head, and it struck. It was a good ballpark, but just underneath it in the outfield, in several places, there was a little ledge just cropping up, and it hit on the ledge and bounced over the fence and made another home run. And this fellow, Elmer Darling, never forgave me. And each time I'd see him each summer, right up till a few years ago when he passed away, and he'd say to me, you and your Chinese home runs. That was most of the greeting I ever got out of him. So that's
I forgot that expression. We used to call the cheap hits, we used to call them Chinese home runs.
yeah.
Never heard it.
You and
Yeah.
your Chinese
I'm
home.
too young.
I never did either. I never heard it before. But Elmer Darling was a character around here, and his family was well known. And
You know, that baseball club from Falmouth that you played on was probably the early beginnings of the Cape Cod Baseball League.
It was. We had a kind of a league, and in my last year there, I think it was Mayor Fitzgerald of Boston, the mother of Rose Kennedy. He footed most of the bills, I think, for the uniforms and so forth. And maybe it was he. If I played extra well, we took in extra money at the gate, contributions, so he gave me $10. Somehow or other, I got paid a little something, and I turned that over to a friend of mine who really needed the money badly that I'd gotten here to play on the team. We really had good teams, the best around there at that time. And
Did any of the-
some of them got, just like I did. They must have gotten, some of them more valuable players than I was, so they must have gotten $10, $20. But later on, with Worcester Academy, when it was founded, I got some money down here for playing baseball. I couldn't play baseball there anymore. That was in 1911 and 12 when Jim Thorpe 1912, he went to the Olympics and won 3 big,
Won the
beautiful first
decathlon?
place gold medals, and later on they made him take it, give them all back, and declared him a professional because he played some dinky little league, something like I did here, down in North or South Carolina.
So Todd, you're up here driving around. What were the roads like then?
Well, of course, the roads were made for and by horses and carriages, and they were very difficult roads if you got off of them. The sand was very deep on both sides, and some of the best roads, of course, had a crushed stone and what the natives called hardening, and then they began to have some tar, oil they put on them, and then they'd cover that with sand, and you'd have to wait for that to dry for at least a day or more and it would get all over the tires and the car, and people would, if they drove on it too soon, would get oily sand on their clothes and probably couldn't get it off.
And I remember that back in the 40s, every year, every summer,
Yeah.
they would sand and oil the roads.
sand
And
and oil the
over the
road.
years, it would gradually build up to a
Then
hard
gradually
pavement.
they got boiling that oil into tar, and then of course they widened the road some, and so 2 cars could pass at once. And
There would have been then a Route 28 and Route 6A would have been the 2 routes along
yes,
Cape Cod.
yeah. When I first got in an automobile, it was a steam car. And of course, to get into the tonneau, as we call it, you went in the roadway and you got in through the back. Not on the side, the back. The door opened on the back. And then gradually they got bigger and better cars. And the white Steamer was a beautiful car and very fast, very, very fast. And would go 40 miles. And we had one eventually. And every 40 miles I had to get out with a bucket in one hand and another and go up to a farmer's house and get water to put in the radiator, because a little lamp-like device under the hood put heat under the water, which you put in the radiator, and it made steam power. And in New England, they made the Stanley steamer, and that became very well known here and was a very successful vehicle. When I was in the garage business there in Harwichport, I sold Pontiac automobiles. It was a new, in 1926, they made the Pontiac factory. And those Pontiacs were very attractive cars. And General Motors came into vogue then. So I had half a dozen customers here in Orleans that came over and bought these Pontiac automobiles. And they were really a new development. And they had 4-wheel brakes, where most of them, except for Chrysler, only had 2-wheel brakes. And they were really newly engineered by General Motors, and that was where they first began to make a hit. And
When you were in Orleans then, you used to go to the Southward Inn?
oh yes, Southwood Inn was a great place. That was a beautiful old inn and very popular, and had a big bar business, and it was
Dancing and entertainment in the summer?
Everything that any good hotel had, it had.
Yeah.
And
Talking parrot.
oh yeah, they had a beautiful, great big old parrot there. He talked very well. I remember that, yeah, sure. And
That must have been when Eve Rich owned it.
yes, Eve Rich owned it. That's right. The Riches owned it. And there was a fine old house, an old rundown mansion on the corner of Route 28 and Main Street, where the town has a park now. And they finally bought that up and destroyed the house and made a park there. Not many people seem to remember that place.
I saw one photograph of that house.
I think the Mayos owned it once.
I saw a photograph of that house in the H.K. Cummings collection in the
Yeah.
library.
Yeah.
It's the only photograph, and it was a beautiful house.
And then in those days, they had a lovely little brick library, the public library here, the Orange Library. I think it was Snow Library.
That's the one that burned down.
And that burned down in a big hurricane in about 1932.
Or a snowstorm, I think.
A snowstorm.
A terrific
snowstorm.
snowstorm.
Yeah.
And I remember when they had a Chautauqua tent right side of H.K. Cummings' place, which is the location of the CCB&T. They had a tent. That was very popular.
Is that a playhouse?
No, they'd have vaudeville things come every summer. It was Chautauqua, they called it. Chautauqua. C-H-A.
T-A-Q-U-A.
Where and when did you first meet your wife?
Well, my present wife.
Your present wife. How many wives have you had, Todd?
Altogether, I've had 3 wives.
Including me.
Then this is my third, and we met in 1964 at the local yacht club, Orleans Yacht Club, and that I'd been a widower then 7 or 8 months, and she had lost her husband 8 or 9 months, and then that operation took rapidly and successfully, and we got married in '65, and some of her very conventional friends and relatives thought she shouldn't get married to me until 1 full year had passed. So we got married in about 10 months' time, and that cost her 1 or 2
Friends. Yeah.
old friends. They thought that was awful. So she was really a conventional lady.
Now, Todd, what is this about you and General Eisenhower? I've heard.
Well, when I was in the First World War, our first encampment was down at Camp Colton, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I think what you want to refer to was when I was early in the Tank Corps then, the United States Tank Corps, was just being formed. And we didn't have any tanks, and we had put in a lot of time in engineering drill and particularly infantry drill. And our commanding officer of the battalion, which I would say must have consisted, that battalion of, say, about 1,000 men at that time. Just at that time, it was just the beginning. Eventually they had 20,000 men there. And all volunteers, no drafted troops at that time. Well, they wanted somebody to drive the commander around in the sidecar that he was given. Although I never had driven a sidecar, but I had a lot of experience with old-time motorcycles. What I remember particularly, he was such a good officer. He was very strict, and he tried to look very strict, but he was I think a genial person inside. One day, he was in a hurry one morning. We went down, he said, "Sergeant, I'm running a little bit late," and that was something for him because he was always just very precise on time. And he said, "We'll have to hurry." So I took the corners pretty fast, and every now and then his side of the sidecar would come up off the ground, and I was aware of it, but he was in a hurry, and I didn't think that was going to do any damage. So we got back, and I remember he said to me something like, "Very good, Sergeant, except I think I should tell you that sometimes it's said that men in the ranks can be expendable, but you should bear in mind that your commanding officer is not." Well, I saluted him, said, "Yes, sir," and turned away, wondering whirl he was talking about, then it dawned on me that he didn't take very kindly to his side of the sidecar going up and down in the air when he made corners. And I knew him a little bit better some months later, and he told me at that time that he thought it was his duty to take very good care of himself. I was going to be in the tank corps because I figured I'd drive a tank up the Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, and I'd take that Kaiser out of his palace by the seat of his pants, the back of his neck, myself personally, if necessary. And I said, I can't do that drive, being a chauffeur. And he looked at me and he wasn't pleased, that was obvious, but he said, well, you'll have to get me a good replacement. And I said, yes, sir, I already got one, a good taxi cab driver from Chicago. And so I said, then I managed to get myself back in the ranks where I belonged, where I was a ranking sergeant in my company. And
what year would that have been, Todd?
That was 1918. That 1918. On account of these things, I got to know the man who became General Eisenhower and then President Eisenhower somewhat. And 21 years later on, after I was discharged and I got my promotion signed by Captain Eisenhower, but when I was discharged from the Army, 20 years after that, or 21 years, I guess, I stood in Madison Square Park in New York City and hit the parade that they gave the soldiers when they came back from World War II stopped momentarily right there in Madison Park, and they had a respite. And I got very close to the General, and I got up all my courage, and I yelled at him and waved my hand at him, saluted him, and said, hello, Ike. To my surprise, it was suddenly all quiet, and he looked at me, and he says, oh, hello, Sergeant. And then there's a slight pause, then he said, Owen, as I remember. He realized, of course, that was an easy thing for him to say, Sergeant, because there were hundreds of thousands of sergeants. And
He remembers going around the corner, I guess.
I don't know what he remembered, but and then I asked some friends later. One of my friends was a major general, another one was a colonel, and they were going down to see, I think he was president, and I asked them, will you ask him if he remembers Sergeant Owen, the First World War in Gettysburg? And they came back and told me, oh yes, he said, he remembered you well. But imagine that, after maybe 21 or 22 years for him to say that.
So his memory is almost as good as yours.
Yeah. He was a good officer. I liked him. I think most everybody liked him.
What is your secret to old age?
You mean to what do I attribute my advanced years?
Yes.
Well,
how do you respond to that?
I think really it's just a matter of good luck, but trying to be serious and answer it, I think it was moderation in everything. I was always athletic in my youth. I was always the smallest kid on every team I was on, but I was always in very good condition. That stood me very in good shape. And it just simply has lasted over the years. I didn't smoke. I smoked very little and I drank very little, and once in a while I drank a little too much, then I'd lay off for maybe 3 months. I didn't want it to become a habit. And I suppose that's what it is. I couldn't say.